Hello there everyone, thank you so much for joining me today. I've got a video series for you here in which I'll be playing a blue-white standard control deck through a league, the most recently released set online being Amonkhet, which I think has done really quite a bit to revive the blue-based control archetype. I'll get to that in just a moment what I mean exactly, but I designed this deck as an alternative. You may notice the distinct lack of Torrential Gearhulk, which is really a staple of any blue-based control deck, whether it be blue-red, blue-white, blue-black, Grixis, or Jeskai, all quite popular with different variations on the same theme. It's just really a staple of the deck, and for good reason. However, for those of us that aren't quite excited about spending a bit of a paycheck on just a play set of digital creatures, I began looking for alternative creatures that I could play that met the same conditions of being a resilient and efficient threat, and I may have stumbled across something that I think is quite viable and competitive, really, and with a bit of testing and refining, perhaps we'll come to the same conclusion at the end of this league. So we'll get to that in just a bit, but as any control deck really, we rely on a bit of removal and a draw package as well as counter spells to prolong the game until we're able to deploy a resilient threat or just really bury our opponents in card advantage that even without a threat on board, they see the inevitability of the game going long and concede out of shame. So where to start? With our control package, we've got a couple of versatile answers here. Perhaps the most basic, straightforward, Immolating Glare. Destroys any attacking creature. There's the obvious limitation of this not being the most effective against creatures like Tireless Tracker, for instance, which gain incremental advantage over time just by existing on the battlefield. If our opponent is keen to what we're doing, they may play around our removal and not attack into open white mana with an Immolating Glare in hand. And we do have alternative ways to answer creatures like Tireless Tracker, Gideon, the champion of Zendikar, ally of Zendikar, excuse me, or Ulamog, the Ceaseless Hunger, or any of the Amonkhet gods, which are all, of course, indestructible and not easily answered by an Immolating Glare. We do have alternatives to those, but Immolating Glare, cheap, efficient removal, cheap enough that you can cast it early in the game to stymie some of your opponent's aggression, also cheap enough that you can hold on to it or draw it later in the game and it's still relevant, still useful. You can cast perhaps a draw or counter spell in the same turn as removing one of their threats. So moving in the same direction, we've got Declaration in Stone. Although a sorcery, lose a bit of that instant playability, it does get around those recursive threats like Dread Wanderer and Scrapheap Scrounger, also Ulamog and the Ceaseless Hunger, and the Amonkhet gods being indestructible because of this exile clause. It's not necessarily card advantage, even if you hit multiples of your opponent's creatures, as they will in time be able to crack those clue tokens, unless we're talking hitting a token creature, such as a Whirler, Virtuoso, Thopter token, or some such. But if you play it early enough, then your opponent has to make the decision of either using that clue to recoup their card, the lost card, or holding on to it until later in the game, in which we probably come across an answer like a board wipe or a counterspell or something, in which case it doesn't really make much difference. So I think playing some number of Declaration in Stone is correct at this point, with zombies and vehicles being a pretty large portion of the metagame, being able to deal with those recursive threats, as I said, Scrapheap Scrounger, Dread Wanderer being two of the bigger ones. Very important for any deck to be able to do, and Declaration in Stone is a very fine answer for those. We've also got Blessed Alliance. Often you can cast it for just 2 mana, but perhaps more often we'll be casting it for 4, ideally. I can't imagine escalating for more than that exactly. Typically what we're going to be doing is having our opponent sacrifice one of their attacking creatures early, but towards the mid or late game we can also recoup some of our lost life at the same time, which makes this one of my favorite removal spells, as it also gets around those indestructible creatures like Gideon, or, God forbid, Ulamog, after the attack has already been carried out. Not ideal, but certainly better than taking 10 every turn. And we can also use it to gain some life on a whim. Those red and black-based aggro decks, if they get you down low enough, and you just have to survive for perhaps 1 or 2 more turns, and then most control players have probably experienced dying to a fatal burn spell. It's very nice being able to, at instant speed, regain some of that life and put yourself out of lethal burn range. So just a very effective and efficient removal spell. As I mentioned, its best application perhaps being able to get around hexproof and indestructible threats. We have enough cheap removal and board wipes that we can generally leave either a vehicle or a planeswalker like Gideon as the sole remaining attacker, and then cleaning up with just a single Blessed Alliance while also gaining some life on the following turn. And then finally, to round out our white removal package, we've also got a Cast Out, which is the most wide catching of removal spells we've got, able to answer any non-land permanent. It is worth noting, however, that this does miss man lands like Wandering Fumarole or Hissing Quagmire, Shambling Vents, but still being able to deal with a resolved planeswalker or indestructible threat or virtually anything that could be posing a threat to you. And the beauty of it, of course, cycling as a mechanic, anytime that you don't necessarily need it, whether it's early in the game and you can't cast it due to a lack of lands, or later in the game once you've cleaned all of your opponent's threats off the board and you're just looking for a creature or a draw spell to close out the game, you can always cycle it away in search of one. Moving on to our counterspell package, we've got a number of Censors, another staple, I think, of Amonkhet, courtesy of Amonkhet. Much in the same vein as Cast Out, able to answer most threats, whether it be early in the game, countering your opponent's 2 or 3 drop on the draw, very important dealing with the Tireless Tracker, for instance, or later in the game if it comes down to maybe a counterspell war against a control player during those pivotal turns where often there will be a flurry of counterspells and whoever's left standing with the last draw spell or threat on the stack usually goes on to win the game. Censor is just a very efficient card, and anytime that you don't have a use for it, you can always just cycle it away for a single blue mana. Perhaps most notable is, due to the popularity of this card, people are often going to play around it, even if it's not in your hand, even if it's not in your deck. There's a very real chance that you'll be playing an opponent who, with a very important threat that they want to resolve, like a Gideon or a Glorybringer, they may take an entire turn off just to guarantee that they can play around your Censor, in which case you may have just bought yourself enough time to find a pivotal spell like a Disallow or a draw spell or something like that. So it's just always nice being able to affect your opponent's playstyle without really doing anything. I do think some number of Censors is correct. I actually started with the full playset before reducing that number somewhat. I'll get to that in a moment with Anticipate. But I think some number of Censors is certainly correct, with a couple of flex slots here for cheaper draw spells. But yeah, Censor I'm very happy with, and I think a number of them is right in any blue-based control deck at this time. We've also got Negate, just a tried and true staple counterspell, perfect in a control mirror, also against decks like Aetherworks Marvel and any Planeswalker or vehicle deck. Just a nice 2-mana counterspell. It's been around almost forever, for as long as I've been playing Standard, a couple of years, and always pulled its weight. We could move a couple of these to the sideboard if the metagame is a bit more aggressive, but I think Negate is much more main deckable, more playable than Essence Scatter currently, just because of the resiliency of some creature threats like vehicles and planeswalkers without actually being creatures. But as I mentioned, if your metagame is a bit more aggressive, then you can always replace a couple of these with maybe Essence Scatter or more Censors. And then finally, Disallow to round out our counterspell package. The answer to just about everything. There are very few uncounterable cards in Standard currently, but being able to deal with any spell, activated ability, or triggered ability. Ulamog's Cast trigger, Aetherworks Marvel, Planeswalkers, even Planeswalker Ultimates. If you have something that needs countering, then there's a good chance Disallow will do it. Of course, if your opponent knows that you're on a blue-based control deck, they're probably not going to ultimate their Planeswalker when a Disallow could be looming over their heads. But once again, you may have just altered their playstyle without them even really having anything to play around. They may just take that extra turn to tick up their Planeswalker before going for the ultimate, just in case you do happen to have a Disallow. And finally, we've got our draw spells to round out the core of our control deck. Anticipate, as I mentioned, at one point these were Censors, but the longer I played, the more I just really wanted to have a 2-mana draw spell, being able to find that critical 3rd or 4th land, maybe a removal spell against an aggressive deck when Censor wasn't really cutting it. Anticipate's just a great draw in your opening hand. It's great to draw later in the game when you're just looking for that one spell. creature or draw spell that will really end the game on the spot. It's just nice to have the ability to look that many cards deeper. As for our actual draw power, instead of just card selection, we've got Glimmers of Genius and a Hieroglyphic Illumination. Again, this is a bit of a flexible situation here where some number of the two is correct. I'm not sure what that might be. Hieroglyphic Illumination, better against the aggressive matchups where you may not be able to take off your turn 4 just to draw a couple of cards. You can cycle it away sooner than that. But of course, Glimmer of Genius, being able to scry 2 first, definitely lets you see more cards, and later in the game that could make all the difference. Being able to dig 4 cards deep instead of just 2 for a board wipe or a creature that you're in desperate need of. So I'm not sure what the correct number to play is, but we'll do a bit of testing throughout the league and maybe come to a conclusion. And finally, we've got Pull from Tomorrow, which I think, as I said earlier, Amonkhet did a lot to revive the blue-based control deck archetype, and this card is the reason why. 2 mana and an X, being able to draw X cards and then discard 1. Ever since Return to Ravnica rotated out and we lost Sphinx's Revelation, blue decks have been kind of on the downswing, bit of a few points here or there with Dig Through Time and Treasure Cruise where they were playable, but without having that way to just draw a million cards late game, and after trading card for card with your opponent, being able to refill your hand is just one of the most demoralizing sights that your opponent can see. And oftentimes, even without ending the game is already is basically over in their eyes, and they'll just concede. If you can get a Pull for Tomorrow, offer 6, 7, 8 cards, there's just not much that they can do to come back from that. So I think playing 3 of these is probably correct. We don't necessarily need the full 4, but depending on how many control decks you expect to go up against, oftentimes it can come down to who's playing more, who draws more, in which case you could probably expand that number, but I think 3 is correct for now. As for our threats, as I mentioned, alternatives to the Torrential Gearhulk, a bit cheaper, and I think just as potent at times. We've got Kefnet the Mindful, 3 mana for a 5/5 flying indestructible, with a bit of a caveat, not being able to attack or block unless you have the full 7 cards in hand. That is admittedly very difficult to do when you're trying to make your land drop every turn, but it is certainly doable. Later in the game, you can always use the 4 mana draw a card. You can pull lands back to your hand, irrigated farmlands if you want to cycle them later when you had to play them early, or a Westvale Abbey to protect from an Ulamog cast trigger exiling it. There's a lot of applications for this, but simply having a 5/5 beater on board that you can hold up all of your mana for a counter spell, for a removal spell, and if your opponent doesn't do anything worth countering or removing, then you can always just sit there and draw a card. The fact that this comes down on turn 3 is very important, and against a control deck, if you can resolve this early enough, especially against red blue decks, which might not have many answers to an indestructible creature, then it can be very, very difficult for them to get out from underneath that. As for our actual, I think, ways to win the game, we've got the 2 angels from Eldritch Moon, Gisela the Broken Blade and her sister Bruna the Fading Light. These are both very different cards in what they do. Gisela being only 4 mana, you can play her early or late with a bit of protection, some counterspell backup, but a flying, first striking, life-linking 4/3 for only 4 mana is very effective at closing out the game quickly, also playing defense because of that first strike, and being able to gain life in those pivotal matchups against mono red or black aggro. Oftentimes, just having a 4-power first striker is enough to deter them from attacking you long enough to play a few more lands and stabilize into the late game. And then finally, if Gisela does meet a grisly end at some point, you can always bring her back, more than likely, unless it was a Declaration in Stone or Incendiary Flow, I think are the 2 most likely to hit her, preventing, due to the exile, preventing her from being reanimated with a Bruna the Fading Light, the bigger of the 2. For 7 mana, we get a 5/7 flying vigilant creature that, just by casting her, can bring back her sister Gisela or a couple of creatures in the sideboard that we're playing. But she closes out the game quite quickly as well. 5 power is certainly a fast clock, and should you have both on the battlefield at the same time, by the end step, they will meld into the all-powerful Brazella Voice of Nightmares, a 9/10 flying, first-striking, vigilant lifelinker that even shuts off about half of your opponent's deck. Due to the metagame as it is now, I can't really think of many ways to answer her, being unable to cast any spell that costs 3 or less, that shuts off like Never to Return, Harnessed Lightning, and multiples of smaller spells, Grasps of Darkness or whatnot. It's just very difficult to deal with her, short of a board wipe or like a sideboarded confiscation coup or a cast out or something like that. And ideally we'll have enough counter spells to deal with that, and they won't really be able to counter back because of the uncastable clause. So she's just a very efficient game ender. It's going to be very difficult to lose if we get a Brazella on the field, and I'm very interested in trying her out, seeing if she is worth a spot in the main deck. Moving on, we've got a couple of Fumigates, pretty straightforward. Always a good way to wipe the board, reset the life totals a little bit, get a buffer against whatever their follow-up play is. I think playing 2 is perhaps correct, depending again how aggressive your metagame is. You can always bring in a couple more. We've got a third one rather in the sideboard, so we'll get to that in a moment. Finally, we've got Forsake the Worldly, nice little versatile card, being able to deal with a vehicle or a Scrap Heap Scrounger or something like that. A resolved Aetherworks Marvel, not ideal. Of course, once it's on the field, it might have already done some damage, but just in case we couldn't counter it and the game's still going, we can always deal with it later. And the beauty of cycling, once again, if it has no use in your hand currently, you can always cycle it away and look for a card that does. So those are all the spells that we're playing. Mana base is pretty straightforward, playing play sets of all the dual blue-white lands, prairie streams, port towns, and farmlands. Again, being able to cycle away land drops early if you're looking for a removal spell, or later in the game once you've kind of stabilized, just looking for a way to close out the game. Irrigated farmland, very important. Also, because the mana requirements aren't too stringent in our deck, we can afford to play a couple of utility colorless lands here. We've got a pair of Westvale Abbeys. Not too often that we'll be able to generate an army big enough for Ormondal to make an appearance, but being able to spit out blockers repeatedly and get a bit of mounting pressure against a slower control deck, perhaps. Westvale Abbey, I think, very efficient card here. Finally, we've got our sideboard. Mostly a couple of counter spells to shore up our matchup against any control decks, and Aetherworks Marvel, Ceremonious Rejection, good against vehicles, and of course Aetherworks Marvel, even hitting Ulamog if they're trying to hardcast it. We've got Dispel, as I mentioned. Those control matchups often come down to one pivotal turn where whoever resolves their spell will win, and you want as many cheap counter spells as you can get. Dispel, one of the cheapest. Another Negate, and Summary Dismissal, perhaps the cleanest answer to an Ulamog, dispatching the cast trigger as well as the creature itself. Also counters Planeswalker ultimates and activations if you just need to buy a turn. Commit to Memory, good little way to get around even some of those uncounterable creatures, if there are any being played, Prowling Serpapard being the only one that comes to mind. And honestly, this mostly will serve as a way to prevent decking ourselves, I think. Playing 3 Pull from Tomorrows with a deck that naturally goes long into the game, decking ourselves is a real concern, and being able to, for 6, just refresh our hand, reset our graveyard, and with all of our lands in play, make use of all those cards. I think some number of these might even be appropriate in the main deck, but we'll see how real of a threat to ourselves that is, decking, and perhaps we can make some adjustments there. Fragmentize, pretty straightforward for the Mardu vehicle matchup. Fumigate against any aggressive decks that we just need to get that 3rd board wipe in. A couple of creatures that we can bring in that our opponents might not be expecting. Thalia's Lancers, 5 mana for a 4/4 first striker that tutors up a legendary card, whether that be a sideboarded Linvala, our Kefnet, or one of our 2 angels that we are already playing, Bruna or Gisela. Leaves a body behind to block with or attack with, and potentially finds, it's like a nice little toolbox card, being able to find one of our other threats. Linvala, perhaps the ultimate stabilizer, 6 mana for a 5/5 flyer, gain 5 life, more often than not, because by turn 6 we probably haven't dealt too much damage to our opponent, and if they've hit us at all, then we'll be able to recoup our lost life, and likely also getting a blocker out of the deal as well. Just a very, very good way to stabilize the board and come back from almost death. And being a 5/5 flyer herself, she's a pretty fast clock too. Last of our creatures we can bring in, Sphinx of the Final Word, unfortunately not legendary, not able to reanimate with Bruna or tutor up with Thalia's Lancers, but still good in its own right. 5/5, flying, hexproof, can't be countered, pretty difficult for a control deck to deal with, short of a board wipe. And most notably, being able to make all of your counterspells trump theirs. Since they can't counter yours, then your counterspells just become hard, no spells. Being able to shut down an Aetherworks Marvel or any of their creatures, and they have no recourse, no way to counter your counter. Most notably, though, we should pay special attention not to rely on that for Cast Out, being an enchantment. That will definitely be counterable, so always be wary of that. But yeah, once again, being a 5-power flyer, it's a clock all on its own, and it makes all of your counter spells uncounterable, including your draw spells. Very powerful threat. And finally, Jace, Unraveler of Secrets. Not sure how good this will be exactly, but definitely has the makings of a control planeswalker, scrying and drawing cards. Good to do in the late game. Bouncing creatures back to their controller's hands. Good for returning maybe one of our creatures if it's been taken by a confiscation coup. And resetting our opponent's creatures as well. And finally, that emblem is pretty much game over for most other decks. By the time we're getting this emblem out, game's gone on probably long enough that your opponent's down to 1, 2, maybe 3 cards. And the fact that they have to burn one of their valuable cards just to be able to cast the second is quite a choice that they have to make. So that is the deck. I'm going to be taking this through a friendly league, and depending on how we do with a few alterations, perhaps we can progress on to the competitive leagues. So thanks for watching so far, everyone. Stay tuned for the matches, and I'll see you soon.